something which is permissible, but in fact it is a form of deception. So therefore it is necessary that we refrain from that. And I'll just give you a couple of examples just here. Firstly, when we go for jobs, and sometimes we deceive them, or we deceive the interviewer, or we may lie regarding our qualifications. We may say to that person, yeah, I've got a degree in law, I've got a degree in medicine, I've got a degree in business, I've got a degree in this and that. And then, or sometimes what happens is that whilst they're getting the job, or the person may ask that, do you have an experience in this particular field? Then you sometimes say, yes, I've done this kind of job for 10 years and so on. You make things up. That is lying. Basically, people will kind of, put another fancy word over that and will say, oh, we're just exaggerating here, we're just blagging a bit. But blagging and exaggeration is also another form of lying. So doing that whilst getting a job whilst you're going for an interview and making up stories that you've got this qualification, you have this, you have that, and then you're getting a job, even though the job may be lawful and so on, but how would there be any barakah and how would there be any blessings in the income you're getting when you lie your way through to get that job? So that is also something which we Muslims, many of us do, and we just think or deem it to be normal, just like making up all these qualifications, making up all these experiences, or we've done this job, we've got this experience, and so on and so forth. That in a way is blatant lying, and that is something which is impermissible and something which is not allowed. And another example which I'll give you of where we do this quite often, but we don't realize it, is when we, for example, intend to get married to someone, or when we go to meet a prospective bride or a prospective suitor, then sometimes we also make up things as well. Okay, obviously, in the last year when we looked at the marriage course, so obviously I looked at it, that which kind of things which you should look at before you intend to get married. When you meet the girl, what kind of question you should ask, so on and so forth. I mentioned this last year in the marriage course. But sometimes what happens is that, the ruling is that to conceal information which you think that if this girl or if the boy was to know or was to find out, they will say no to the marriage. Then to keep that concealed is also comes under the ambit of deception. Like, for example, just say your previous marital status was that you're a divorcee, or you've been divorced before, you already have a wife. So when you go to meet this girl, obviously, now don't get me wrong, it's nothing like haram marrying someone who's divorced and so on. Obviously, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's wives, besides Sayyidah Aisha radhiyallahu anha, they were either divorcees or they were either widows. So it's permissible to marry someone who's widowed, someone who's already been divorced. But just say, for example, if you think that if I conceal this, and if she was to know about it, then she will say no to the marriage, then for you to conceal that, that will also be unlawful, and that will also be haram as well. And similarly goes for vice versa, that, for example, if the girl, she's already been married before, and then for her to conceal those kind of information, that if the prospective groom was to find out, then he will probably say no to the marriage, then to conceal those kind of information will be considered unlawful and haram. So just a few examples. Obviously, there's other examples which inshallah we'll look at during the course of the tafsir. Now, the next verse which we're going to start is verse number 21, which is also the beginning of the third ruku and the third section of Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nasu ubudu rabbakum. The O people, worship your Lord. Ubudu rabbakum. The O people, worship your Lord. Now, the question which arises here is, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala use the word an-nas? So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, He could have just used the word Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, or those who believe, u'budu rabbakum, worship your Lord. But why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala use the word in particular an-nas, which just means generally people? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala use that particular word? Now, the wisdom behind this particular reason, or you could say that there's a subtle indication here that the word an-nas is not meant just for the Muslims here, but it's meant for those three types of people or three categories of people who were mentioned in the first and the second ruku. Because remember, all this surah is all linked with each ruku and each section. So in the first two rukus, we looked at three categories of people. So here the word Ya ayyuhan nas, O people, it means O God-fearing people. Those alladhina yu'minuna bil ghayb, who believe in the unseen, وَيُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةِ, who establish the salah, and whatever they have been given, whatever they have been blessed with, they spend in the path of Allah. وَالَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ وَمَا أُنزِلَ مِنْ قَبْلِكَ, and they believe in what has been revealed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what has been revealed before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's saying that Ya ayyuhan nas, oh God-fearing people, u'budu rabbakum, according to them will be continue with your worship of your Lord. So u'budu rabbakum, for a God, because of a God-fearing person, a believer, he's already worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here, Ya ayyuhan nas, u'budu rabbakum will mean that, oh God-fearing people, continue worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Continue your ibadah with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then from Ya ayyuhan nas, if you're using it in the context of the disbelievers, that if the word an-nas here means the disbelievers, the kuffar, so here Ya ayyuhan nas will mean, oh disbelievers, leave everything, leave your idols, leave Lat and Uzza. These, Lat and Uzza, by the way, were two idols which the disbelievers had. So leave Lat and Uzza, leave all your idols and so on, and u'budu rabbakum, and begin worship and start worshipping your Lord. Start worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is one, who is the Khaliq, and who is the creator of this world. And then Ya ayyuhan nas, if you're using it in the context of the hypocrites and the munafiqs, will mean that, oh hypocrites, oh munafiqs, leave all your deception out, leave all the lying, leave all these tricks and things that outwardly you're claiming to be believers and then inwardly you still have kufr and hypocrisy. Leave all that out, u'budu rabbakum, and worship your Lord. So that is the subtle indication that here the word Ya ayyuhan nas is not just restricted to the believers, but here the word Ya ayyuhan nas applies for all categories of people, applies for the disbelievers, it's applying here to the hypocrites and the munafiqs, and also it's applying to the God-fearing people. The next word Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, u'budu rabbakum, worship your Lord. Now what is meant by ibadat, or what is meant by worship? Now this word ibadat is, in Arabic, it's known as a jami' word. Now, jami basically means it's a very, very comprehensive word. It's a small word or just one word, but it has a lot of meaning. Now, the word u'budu rabbakum basically means that total obedience and total submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That 100% you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and 100% you submit yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ibadat doesn't mean, like for example, you doing something, but then you start questioning why are we doing this? That what is the reason behind it? Or what is the illah and what is the wisdom behind it? That is not submission. Submission is like Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. Or like for example, the rituals of Hajj, or like Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was going to say is that when he was told to sacrifice his son, then he did it. He didn't ask, oh, why do I have to sacrifice my son Ismail alayhi salam, and so on and so forth. Or like, for example, the rituals of Hajj, like, going around the Baytullah 7 times, doing sa'i, the pelting of the jamarat and so on. That is submission, because you're doing it without asking the reason why, what is the wisdom behind it, because intellectually it doesn't make sense, going around the Baytullah 7 times, pelting the jamarat and so on. But you're doing it, why? Because it is a order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is an order, and it is a ruling from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that is the meaning of ibadat. Total obedience and total submission to Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So from this definition of ibadat, we can conclude, or we can deduce, that there are two things here. Firstly is basically, when you look at it, analyze it, all the legislations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all the ahkams, all the rulings from the Holy Quran that give zakat, read namaz, fasting and so on, to do that and to submit yourself to do that, meaning that you do it with this love, because this is a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this is a command of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, without asking the reason why, without questioning the wisdom why, that is in itself, that is called ibadah. So from this we can understand that ibadah has two aspects of it. One is the physical aspect of the ibadah, and one is the inward aspect of ibadah, i.e. from the heart. And examples of physical aspects of ibadah will be, like for example, reading your namaz, giving zakat, going for hajj, fasting, and so on and so forth. And at the same time also, ibadah will also include, like for example, telling the truth. That is a form of ibadah. Or like for example, refraining from backbiting, refraining from slandering. That is a form of ibadah. Being kind to your parents. That is a form of ibadah. Being good with your brothers, sisters, your neighbors, your relatives, and so on. That is also a form of ibadah. For example, Amr bil ma'ruf, nahyu anil munkar, bidding the fair and forbidding the unfair. That is also a form of ibadah. Being kind to the poor, that is also a form of ibadah. Even to the extent that being kind to your children, your wives, and so on, that is also a form of ibadah. Being kind to animals, that is also a form of ibadah. Even to the extent that, according to a hadith of Sahih al-Muslim, having sexual intercourse with a wife is known as sadaqah. It's an act of reward. That is also a form of ibadah. So all these physical acts come under the ambit of ibadah and worship. And then an example of, say, ibadah from the heart will be, like for example, to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or when you've done a sin, to do tawbah, repentance, istighfar, zikr, and all these kind of things, and being patient and so on. These are ibadah as well, but ibadah from the heart. So from this, what I'm trying to say is that u'budu rabbakum doesn't mean worship Allah, or doesn't mean, like for example, read namaz, that's it. Yeah, you have not just read namaz, that's it. No. Worship means here a complete way of life. That doing everything a Muslim, a true Muslim should do according to the teachings of Islam. Whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated, whatever rulings Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given, whatever Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has said, the halal, the lawful things and so on, to do that, and the things which Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has prohibited us from to do, i.e. the unlawful things, then to refrain from that, that is called ibadah. Ibadat isn't coming to the mosque, reading your 5 daily prayers, and then as soon as you leave the mosque, start backbiting about other people. Or as soon as you leave the mosque, you start doing haram. You start, cheating people. You start doing some fraud and so on, and these kind of things. That is not complete ibadah. But ibadah is your whole life according to the teachings of Islam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that Ya ayyuhan nas u'budu rabbakum, that worship your Lord. And some other examples, like obviously the example which I have given was with regards to ibadah from a physical aspect and from an inward aspect. But sometimes, like, involving yourself in social activities or helping other brothers, which an incident which has got nothing to do with you, that is also a form of ibadah. Just say, for example, they are like two brothers and they've just had a fight and so on, or they've had a quarrel, then for you to go and then act as a hakim, for you to act as like a judge, meaning that for you to solve the problem out, that is also a form of ibadah. Okay? Also, another important aspect here is working and earning a livelihood. That is also a form of ibadah. And earning a halal livelihood, earning such a livelihood where 100% your income is lawful and halal, that is also a form of ibadah. Because when you work, you're working to provide for your wives, you're earning to provide for your children. And as you know, that as soon as you get married, there are 3 rights automatically which become wajib and obligatory for you to fulfill. They are that you need to provide for your wife's clothing, for your wife's maintenance, and for your wife's shelter. So that's what you work for. And as I just mentioned, that looking after your wife, caring for your wife, being kind to your wife, that is also a form of ibadah. So similarly, working as well, that is also a form of ibadah. Now for the next few minutes, I'm going to just touch on this topic of working and earning a livelihood in more detail. Because earning a livelihood and working is, as I just mentioned, it's an ibadah, it's an act of worship. And there are some people, or many people, who think that actually working or earning a livelihood is against Islam. That Islam just says that just come to the mosque, read your 5 daily prayers, and that's it. You don't have to work and so on. But when we look at the Anbiya alayhi salatu wassalam, their practice was that they would also work. They would also earn a livelihood as well. And it comes in a hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari where the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that no prophets have been sent except as a shepherd. All the prophets who have been sent, they have always been a shepherd. Then the Sahabas, they asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that even you, were you a shepherd? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied that yes, I was also a shepherd and I would graze the sheep around the mountain tops of Makkah for a few qirat. Qirat is a few coins made out of copper. So even Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, before he became a prophet, before he was really engrossed and really busy with the prophethood, he used to work. He was a shepherd. He used to graze goats and so on. Even when you look in the hadith of Sahih al-Muslim, it says, Kana Zakaria Najjara. That Hazrat Zakaria alayhi salam was a carpenter. So Hazrat Zakaria alayhi salam, even though he was a prophet, he was a carpenter. He would work. Even Hazrat Dawood alayhi salam, he was a prophet, but at the same time, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made metal soft for him, so he would make the metal, he would tailor it, he would make armors from the metal, and then after that he would sell it. Even to the extent that it comes in the hadith of Kanzul Ummal, this is a statement of a Sahabi, that Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, he says that if a person who looks religious to me, this is the words of Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, that if a person, if he looks religious to me, so I will ask him that what do you do? What is your profession? And if this person replied by saying that, no, I don't have a profession, I don't have an occupation, then these are the words of Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, that person's respect will fall from my eyes. Meaning that I won't consider him to be honorable anymore. Why? Because he doesn't have a job. Okay? Obviously, if you've got excuses, you can't do work and everything, that is something different. But just generally speaking, those who are healthy, who can work, then this is a sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay? Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu wasn't that like you just sit in the mosque and so on. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam decided to do so many other things. So that is very important that you work. It's not, as I said, Islam isn't that you just read your namaz and that's it. Okay, you have to earn a livelihood. You have to look after your family. You know, besides your wives and your children, you may have, you know, old parents who can't work. So you are liable to look after them as well. So again, you need to work to look after them. So it's very important that you work. But obviously, Islam says that you shouldn't work to such an extent that you forget about Allah, you forget about Islam. It shouldn't be such that you're working 20 hours a day and you forget about your namaz, you forget about your fajr, you forget about your zuhr, asr, maghrib and isha. Obviously, there should be a balance between them two. But working, what I want to say is that it's not against, you know, being a pious Muslim. Okay, you could be a pious Muslim and you could work as well. There's no like tazad. Tazad means there's no contradiction between them two. Okay, a contradiction is something like you read your namaz and after that you go and start swearing. That is a contradiction because Muslims, they don't swear. Or you read your namaz and you do everything and then you go outside and you start cheating people, you start deceiving people, you start doing fraud and so on. That is tazad. There's this contradiction there because a true Muslim won't do those kind of things. So it's very important that we earn a livelihood, but at the same time it's also very important that we earn a halal livelihood as well. Okay, that's the main two conditions. They are, number one, that we work, but we make sure that the work doesn't take over our life, don't take over our religious obligations, and also at the same time we have to make sure that what we're earning is halal and lawful. Why? Because it comes in a hadith of Sahih al-Muslim narrated by Sayyidina Abu Hurairah anhu. It's a long hadith, but the main outcome of the hadith is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying, or he narrates a story of a traveler. Now, obviously, as we know that a person who is a traveler, his dua and his supplication is always accepted. So there's this traveler, he's been traveling for so long and so on, there's dust all over his body, his clothes are all over the place and so on, his hair is all over the place. So this person, he spreads his hands, he makes a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this person's dua will not be accepted. His supplication will not be answered. Why? Because the food he is eating is unlawful. The clothes he is wearing is unlawful. The body, the flesh has been nourished with something which is unlawful. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying that how can this person's dua and supplication be accepted? So therefore, it's very important that we as Muslims, we make sure that, that is the comprehensive meaning of ibadah. That we do everything according to the teachings of Islam, and obviously the jobs we get or the jobs which we have, okay, we have to make sure that the income is 100% lawful and halal. Now, keeping this particular principle in mind, we're just going to, probably the remaining of this lesson and next week's lesson, we'll be looking at some types of jobs which obviously we need to look at that whether they are permissible or not. Okay, not all the types of jobs because obviously there's so many jobs. Obviously, we won't have time to look at every single job, but obviously just some main types of jobs, whether they are permissible or not. And the question you need to ask yourself, just say for example, you're thinking of, you're looking for a job and so on. The question you need to ask yourself is that there has to be two conditions which needs to be found for a job to be considered lawful and halal. The first condition is that the nature of the job. Now what you're doing, just the nature, the actual job itself, that what you are required to do, what is in your contract, whether that is lawful or not. And the second condition is that the income you're receiving. Okay? So, and these two conditions have to be found, okay, for the job to be considered lawful and halal. So it's the nature of the job, and number two, the salary you're receiving. Okay? It could be a halal job you're doing, but if the salary you're receiving is from somewhere haram, then obviously that will make that job unlawful. Or similarly, the job you may be doing is something which is like lawful, but the job you may be doing is something which is unlawful, but even though the salary is halal, it would not make that job lawful and halal. Okay, so that is very important. Now let's give you an example before we finish. Is the main question which people ask is regarding working in banks, that whether working in banks is permissible or not. Okay, now obviously we look at this particular issue in more detail when we look at the verse regarding riba later on in the surah. But obviously there are many hadiths indicating towards the severity of taking interest, taking riba, taking interest. Hadith of Sunan Abu Dawud, where the Prophet of Allah ﷺ has cursed those people who take interest, who give interest, who witness interest transactions, who write interest transactions. And then in Sahih Muslim, it's got the words that all four of them are equal in the sin. It doesn't mean that a person who like gives the interest, his sin is more than the person who's taking it, or the person who, like for example, is just witnessing it, his sin will be far less, and the person who's just writing it down on the computer, whatever, then his sin will be far less. No, everyone will be equal in the sin. So interest transaction is something which is haram and unlawful in Islam. Now keeping that in mind, working in a bank as a cashier or as a manager would not be permissible at all. Okay, would be strictly prohibited and would not be allowed. Okay, why? Because when you like your cashier and so on, so obviously when people coming in and they're giving the deposit and then you're witnessing the interest transaction taking place, you're writing down, you're recording the interest transaction and so on. So therefore, working in a bank would not be permissible, would not be allowed. If you're a cashier, and obviously if you working in the management side of it, why? Because the nature of the job is unlawful. So because that first condition hasn't been found, so therefore that job would also be unlawful as well. However, working in a bank, say like as a like you have like what you call call centers. Now again, the ruling will be slightly different. Now if the call center, just say you got a job as answering calls and so on, if the job entails you to just basically talk about the accounts of that particular individual, not talk about any interest transaction, not offering him a mortgage service, not offering him some other kind of like accounts where, you know, basically there's interest going on, but you just generally offer him, or you're just giving him or telling him some information regarding his account. Like for example, this person, he opens his statement and he sees that, or he put in a £200 deposit, but in the statement he just says £100. So he just phones them, he phones this guy, the call center, and the call center, the guy just says, oh, it's probably a mistake. That's it, you know, those kind of stuff just regarding general information regarding the account. Now in that situation, that job will be permissible, okay? Because the nature of the job, that is lawful, that is permissible. Now you may be thinking, but the salary he's getting, that's from interest, so that should be haram, that should be unlawful. But with regards to that, the scholars have said, in particular Mufti Taqi in his contemporary fatwas has said, that not all the money in a bank or which is stored in a bank is haram. Okay, so not all the money stored in a bank is haram. Now what do I mean by that? Basically in a bank you have money deposited by the depositors, you have basically capital given by the owners of the bank, and then you have interest money. And interest money in comparison to the other two, i.e. the depositors' money and the money given by capital by the owners, it is far less. And as you know that rulings or fatwas are given on aksar. Aksar means on the majority. So because the majority of the income is lawful. Like it's like a mixture between halal income and haram income, but because the majority is lawful, so therefore that particular job will be permissible. What you should do, what the scholars have advised to do in such a situation, is that just give some amount which you think, or a certain percentage from your weekly or your monthly wage slip, give it away to charity without the intention of reward or sawab. So basically working as I said, like in a call center, but if the call center, say for example, involves you to like, talk about interest transaction, then obviously that would not be allowed. And obviously working in a bank, say as a cleaner or as a guard and so on, then that would be allowed. Okay, that would be permissible. Why? Because as I said, the nature of the job, just being a guard, there's nothing haram with that, because obviously during the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, many Sahabas were like guards and they would like guard the Islamic state and so on. So there's nothing wrong in being a guard, being a cleaner, being a cook in a bank. There's nothing wrong with those kind of jobs. Why? Because the nature of the job is halal. He's not witnessing, he's not there whilst the interest transactions are being taken place and so on. So because of the nature of the job is halal, and because of, as I said, the second condition, i.e. because most of the income and the majority of the income is lawful and halal, so therefore such a job will be permissible. Shall I just leave it here at this point? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to act on what has been said. Wa akhir da'wana. Alhamdulillah. Do you have any questions?